Our second scripture reading today is from Luke 17, verses 11 through 19. This is a healing story, a miracle story, but there's an underlying current of gratitude in it, or a lesson on gratitude that I thought would be very appropriate for us coming into the Thanksgiving holiday. So I invite you to listen for God's word as we hear it from Luke chapter 17. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, and praising God with a loud voice, he prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So a street vendor had a cart where she sold pretzels for 50 cents apiece. And every day, a young lawyer would exit his office building at lunch, and as he passed by her pretzel cart, he would leave 2 quarters on it. But he never took a pretzel. This went on for nearly 5 years. Even though they never spoke to each other, never said a word, every day he would leave 50 cents, make eye contact with her. She would look back at him and nod in appreciation as he walked away without a pretzel. Finally, one day, as the lawyer passed her stand and laid down his 2 quarters, the pretzel vendor spoke to him. "Sir, I appreciate your business. You are my best customer, but I have to ask you something." And tapping the sign on the side of the cart, she said, "Have you noticed that the price of pretzels has gone up to 75 cents? Who was it that said expectation is the enemy of gratitude? You know, in the reading from Luke today, we have a fantastic lesson on gratitude, a demonstration of God's goodness and the potential human responses to it. Our story begins with 10 lepers. Now, leprosy in the ancient world is kind of a catch-all term. It's used for several different kinds of skin diseases, so it's hard to know exactly what condition these men had. It could have been what we mean by leprosy today, which is what we now call Hansen's disease, a bacterial infection that affects the nervous system and leads to painful skin sores and disfigurement and loss of limbs and digits and other extremities. It could have been something else in the broad range of communicable skin diseases as well. We don't know for sure. But for these men, we know the result. It was exile. In that day, if you were diagnosed with anything that fell under the category of leprosy, it meant that you were no longer welcome in society. You would be immediately cut off from your family, from worship, from work, from everything. It was considered necessary to protect the rest of the community, and so you would have been sent out to live in the wilderness. In fact, you would have been required to keep your distance from all towns and travelers, and if you saw somebody approach on the road and they were getting too close, you were supposed to shout, "Unclean, unclean," to identify yourself and give them warning. Imagine having your identity so defined by your illness. Most of us have never met a leper, I would wager. Hansen's disease is not a common condition today. For first world countries, it's treatable, and up to 95% of us actually have a natural immunity to it anyway. But for those who have leprosy, the result, even today, can be much the same as it was back then. Once on a high school mission trip in Thailand, I actually visited a leper colony. It was the only time I've ever met lepers in my life. We were sent to work on the dam at the colony where they lived, which was actually, it was literally an island in the middle of a river, because this was where they were required to live, where they would not come into contact with anybody else. And several of these people were missing fingers or hands or feet or ears. They weren't at all trying to hide their disfigurement. It was just reality for them. And it was obvious as we worked among them how thrilled they were that anybody was willing to get near them. That was something they just didn't experience in regular life. Now, if I'd been preaching this passage a year ago, I would have noted how none of us can really understand that emotional pain of separation, of being labeled as unclean and being taken away from your loved ones, being kept apart, being unable to shake hands and to hug and to go to church and to go to market. Of course, now in the current COVID-19 world, maybe we do understand. Maybe we have experienced that, at least a little bit. You know, we can empathize with the plight of these 10 lepers more today than we ever could before, even if they had it much worse. You know, think about how frustrated, how disappointed, how upset you may have been over all the limitations that you've had to endure in this pandemic. For us, it's been less than a year. For them, leprosy was a lifetime sentence. It was a life spent apart from everyone else. So these 10 recognize Jesus and they cry out to him, "Master, can you help us? Master, have mercy on us." There is some sense among them that Jesus is someone who can do something for them. Surely they're desperate for any kind of healing they can get, anything that will allow them back into their old lives, but keeping their distance, keeping their masks on, showing Jesus respect and not putting him at risk, they call out and they ask for his mercy. And he responds, "Go see the priest." What a weird response. I mean, imagine somebody saying today, "I think I got COVID. I'm going to go see Pastor Dave." Please don't do that, by the way. just don't. But this is the standard practice in Israel. The priest, in addition to being a religious leader, is sort of a public health official. He's not a doctor, he doesn't treat your illness, but after you become well, he's the one who gives you a clean bill of health. He's the one who does the examination and says, "Okay, you're ready to come back into polite society." There are several conditions and diseases in Levitical law where the prescription is to self-quarantine until you're better, and so the priest is the one who has to give you the all clear afterward. What Jesus is saying here, when he says, "Go see the priest," is he's saying, you're good. Everything is good. You're ready to return to normal life. Which, please note, is not the case. It is not the reality, at least not yet. Jesus hasn't done anything yet. He sends them off unwell. And the only reason they would go to the priest at that point is if they believed that something would change on the way, that somehow things would be different by the time they got there. Well, they do go, and on the way, they notice that they have been made clean. And we could end the story here, and it would be a really powerful lesson on faithfulness. Sometimes we want God to do something, but before we see any evidence of God's answer, it comes time for us to make a choice. Are we going to love that person who we find hard to forgive? Or are we going to keep waiting for them to do something to earn our forgiveness, to show that they are repentant? Will we commit our resources to an important project? Or are we going to sit back and keep waiting for other donors to step up? So many missionaries or church planters will tell you stories of the ministry that they felt called to begin and how they saw nothing there at first, but once they started building, they realized how much work God had already done preparing that ministry. Sometimes we ask God for help, and we have to start moving before we see the results. These lepers started moving in faith before Jesus healed them, and on the way to the priest, what they were hoping for became a reality. I think that's amazing. Of course, the story doesn't end there. This is where it really starts to get good, because when they realize that this miracle has taken place, 9 of the former lepers respond in a completely understandable excitement, and they continue on their way to the priest, just as Jesus had directed them. They realize that what he said actually happened, and they continue to go to the priest where they can get that approval or that clean bill of health. 9 healed men are so overwhelmed with relief and with happiness and with their new sense of freedom that they rush onward to make things official and to get back to their lives and their families that they thought they might never see again. And one man, equally overwhelmed and overjoyed, turns around and rushes back and throws himself at Jesus' feet, giving thanks and praise to God. Having received the exact same life-altering gift as these other 9, they move forward with exuberance. He turns back in gratitude. 9 of them think about what this gift means for themselves. 1 of them thinks about where this gift came from. 10 men have faith enough to ask Jesus for healing and set out where he directs them as if they had already received it. But only 1 of them in the end really gets it. Oh, and that one is a Samaritan. I love how Luke just kind of throws that in like an afterthought. But Jesus certainly notices that this one is an outsider. Where are the other 9, he asks. Why is it that a foreigner is the only one who came back to give thanks? And Jesus already knows the answer, but he's making a point here. Faithfulness is good. Thankfulness is better. Faithfulness is what the Israelites can manage. Thankfulness only came from the outsider. And maybe this has something to do with what I said earlier, that expectation is the enemy of gratitude. Maybe in some way the Israelites could have expected Jesus' healing, while the Samaritan who expected nothing was truly stunned and shocked when he received it. And maybe that's what gave him the ability to fully appreciate what had happened and to go off and shout praises to God. I know whenever we do that Thanksgiving tradition of going around the table and telling what we're thankful for this year, naming those things, we don't tend to name the things that we expected or counted on, do we? We name the surprises. We name the new love or the new job. We name the opportunity that showed up at the exact right time or the disaster that we narrowly avoided. We name the good that we recognize might not have happened. We seldom name the things we take for granted, the things that we think of as par for the course. Perhaps what Luke is saying is that the Samaritan was the only one who didn't take Jesus' healing for granted. Did you notice that where we have expectations, so does God? God's expectation is that when he does something worthy of our praise, we will notice it. We will turn back and give thanks. The Samaritan's praise is the right response. It's the one that Jesus affirms, the 1 in 10. And that says to me that praising God, while maybe nowhere near as common as it should be, is what God expects. Praising God means that you've recognized what God has done, and you have affirmed that it is praiseworthy because you truly see what God has done, and you realize that the alternative, if God had not done anything, how could you not praise? If God has done anything for you and your response is, well, of course, I mean, that's what God does, let's move on, I think you've missed it. God's goodness should stop us in our tracks. God's goodness should bring us to our knees. God's goodness, when we see it, should make us drop everything and lift up thanks and praise. I'm sure that Samaritan returned to Jesus in thanksgiving because he saw God's work, God's goodness, with a clarity that the others didn't. I love this story about Natalie, a businesswoman who worked in downtown Chicago. And every morning on the way to work, she passed a heavy-set, middle-aged woman wearing a shabby coat and asking for spare change. Now, this woman would greet everyone with a cheerful good morning. She had such a vibrant, wonderful smile. She was so positive in her attitude. And Natalie almost always stopped and gave her something. After almost a year of this routine, however, the woman in the shabby coat disappeared, and Natalie wondered what had happened to her. Then one beautiful day, as she was passing by that same corner, there was the woman holding a large paper bag. And as Natalie reached into her purse for some coins to give to the woman, she stopped her. She said, "Thank you for helping me all those days in the past. You won't see me here again because I've got a job now." And with that, she reached into her bag and she handed Natalie a donut. She'd been standing at her old spot waiting, not for a handout, but for the people who she recognized, so that she could give them back something for all that they had given to her in the past. Some way to thank them for all their kindness. Now that's gratitude, right? Seeing that somebody did something for you that made a difference and wanting to give them something back. That's the gratitude the Samaritan has for Jesus. And all he has to give back is praise, but that's okay. I mean, when it comes to God, that's all any of us really has to give. So he praises loudly, wholeheartedly, shamelessly, and he is affirmed by Jesus for giving that praise. Jesus' final words to this Samaritan are fascinating to me. "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." And for years, I've either puzzled over or ignored that statement because it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. Your faith has made you well? What's he talking about? I mean, didn't faith make all 10 of the lepers well? What's different about this one? And wasn't he already healed before he came back to give praise? What does Jesus mean? Well, in studying the passage this week, I looked at the Greek, and I think I finally figured it out. The answer is always in the Greek. But there are actually 3 unique words that Luke uses describing healing throughout this passage. And the first in verse 15, one of them, when he saw that he was healed, is in Greek hyatha, which is a medical term. It means to mend, to repair. It's kind of the stitching a wound closed kind of word. The next in verse 17, Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed?" And that's a different word from hyatha. The word here is katharizo, the root word for our catheter. And it also has a medical sense of removing impurities. But in addition, this word has religious connotations. The Jewish understanding of cleansing united the physical and the spiritual. And so a person who was free of their illness would be pronounced clean or cleansed by the priest. That's exactly the declaration that the former lepers wanted. But the last word that Jesus says here to the thankful Samaritan is, "Your faith has made you well." Again, a different word. It is sozo. Sozo, which is usually translated in other places as saved. The Greeks used that word to describe people who escaped dangerous situations. Sailors who survived a shipwreck were called sozo. When Matthew began his gospel, he started it with the Christmas story, and the angel who came to Joseph told him to name the Christ child Jesus because that was the name for the one who would save the people, who would sozo the people. Paul used that same word to talk about people making confessions of faith in Jesus. He says, "If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be sozo." You will be saved. For it's with your heart you believe and are justified, and it's with your mouth that you confess and are saved. So here we have a grateful man, a religious outsider, who was faithful enough to follow Jesus' command before he saw any evidence of change, and then chooses to worship God before enjoying any of the blessings he's received. And this is the man, the 1 in 10, who Jesus pronounces fully healed, body and soul. He's the one, the only one, who gets a completely clean bill of health from Jesus. All 10 lepers received physical restoration. Only this one has truly seen Jesus, truly seen what he has done, and given thanks. This man, Jesus says, gets it. Do we? Friends, this is the good news for the people of God. Thanks be to God.